We're going to start the program tonight by taking a global look at permaculture, but then later in the evening, we're going to do a deep dive and look at some of the exciting events that are happening locally and exciting activities. The host of tonight's program, Alan Wight, and he's also our series coordinator, wears a variety of hats, all that are very germane to both the Lloyd Library and permaculture, blending together the subjects of science, medicine, plants, and the environment. He's on the faculty of the Good Samaritan College of Nursing, and he also works very closely with the University of Cincinnati and Cincinnati State on initiatives that involve forestry and food. In addition to that, he has his own project called Edible Cities, which we'll hear a little bit about tonight. Parts of tonight's program are pre-recorded, were pre-recorded, but our speakers are with us here tonight. So if you have a question either during or after the program, please use the chat function and we'll be pulling those together and our speakers will join us and address those questions. Before handing the program over to our permaculturist, I would like to say a special thanks to the members of the Lloyd Library. The members program helps support events and webinars like this. And if you're not a member, I hope you will consider joining the Lloyd Library. You can go to our website and find membership information. I'd also like to thank the Cincinnati Permaculture Institute and also 10th Acre Farm for their sponsorship and their support. We've heard in plenty of advertisements, don't try this at home. In fact, I'm going to ask just the opposite of you. Please take away some of the things that you see and that you learn tonight and try it at home. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the host of tonight's program, Alan Wight.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Lloyd Library and Museum Permaculture Webinar Series. My name is Alan Wight, and tonight we're going to talk about the potential of permaculture. This first series looks at the city and suburbs specifically. This is part of a larger project called Edible City and Art Atlas, which is hosted by Green Umbrella, and it explores our food shed, past, present, and future. I'd just like to take a moment and thank everybody tonight, our hosts, the Lloyd Library and Museum. I'd like to thank Patricia. I'd like to thank Aaron. I'd also like to thank Amy and Braden, our two speakers who will be talking more about these practices. This is the overview. We're going to talk a little bit about permaculture. I just want to say that if you're interested in learning more about permaculture, that you should definitely contact one of our speakers. Classes are offered, and there's a lot more that you can dive into regarding this topic. I'm then going to introduce the speakers, and Braden is going to talk about some theory and education and the resources. He's then going to talk a little bit more about the cityscape specifically. Amy's going to spend some time talking about the transformation of the suburbs, and we'll take a moment at the end to kind of talk about the visions that we have for moving forward in terms of applying these practices and principles across the region and ultimately the world. And then at the end, we will have some question and answers. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. This is a really special series, and we appreciate you as audience members and look forward to hearing your questions. So permaculture is a design science. It's centered on whole systems thinking, and it uses patterns and resilient features from the natural environment and ecosystem to help us humans create a more permanent, sustainable, and resilient culture. The word permaculture at first meant permanent agriculture, but has now been modified to mean permanent culture, specifically talking about the human-animal's relationship with the planet. Permaculture takes what had been applied bioregionally throughout the world in terms of traditional ecological knowledge and merges it with modern design principles. These practices were laid out by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren in 1978. And what they did is they made it globally accessible to people across the world, which had not necessarily been done before. Permaculture is built on three main ethics. It is about people care. It is also about fair share, and it is about earth care. So it's a matter of how can we do all of these things at once together where they work in harmony with each other. This is the permaculture flower, which goes into depth a little bit more about those 3 principles. You'll see them at the center of the flower. There are then 12 principles that help to build out what this design science is. And I just want to mention that even though tonight we're going to talk about permaculture with a specific eye towards food production, that permaculture is not just about food. Permaculture is about the entire human-earth relationship. It is about energy. It is about buildings. It is about culture. It is about us and our own spirituality. It's about transformation. It's about equity, economics. It does include technology, both high tech and low tech. It's about health. So it's really a holistic understanding of how we can have a better relationship with Mother Earth. So tonight, as mentioned, we're going to get into an emphasis on food production, and we're going to be talking a little bit about perennial agriculture in a sense, or forest crops or forest gardens. And so what you see before you is a diagram that has been laid out by our very own Doug Crouch, who will be featured in the 2nd series. And when we think about food production, I'm going to ask you to not think about the cornfield or not think about the soy field, but rather to think about architecture and to think about height and to think about how we can use the sun's energy at all layers here, not just the 6 feet for corn, but we're talking about the top of a canopy. We're talking about underneath the canopy for other fruit and nut production. We're talking about shrubs and bushes and grasses and the herbaceous layer. We're also talking about the rhizome and what grows in the roots. And we're talking about soil health. We're talking about food as energy. I don't know if you guys have ever thought about it, but when we talk about energy in terms of calories, you can actually understand food as being one of our primary energetic relationships with the planet, right? About 1/3 of our greenhouse gases that we emit are wrapped up in terms of food production. Obviously, food as thy medicine or food as health is really important here, especially when we consider the fact that we are in the middle of a global pandemic. And we're also talking about landscape here. We're talking about transforming the city, we're talking about transforming the suburbs, and we're talking about how come when we walk down the street, we don't see fruit trees or we don't see nut trees. So we're talking about making a reconnection here in terms of the things that we plant, in terms of how they can serve us while the things that we plant also serve the broader ecosystem. In permaculture, we often like to talk about zones. I've got another diagram after this, which gives a little bit better visual, but it really starts with you. It starts with inside the human body, if you want to think about that as an ecosystem. It moves then out to your house or your immediate settlement. The zone number 1 would be a kitchen garden, right? Something that might be frequently visited outside of your house itself. Then you talk about maybe more direct food production, a larger market garden. It could be landscaping, that's a little bit further out. Zone 3, we talk about more of a pasture or a cash crops. Zone 4 is where you maybe don't visit all the time. It's a little bit more for recreational purposes. And then ultimately zone 5 would be what was traditionally thought of as nature or wilderness that is minimally managed. I actually think that this next diagram does a much better job of talking about these concentric rings and the circles and how these things can connect. So before I fully introduce our speakers, I just want to say that what we're talking about here is not just the garden scale or the home scale. This is the city scale. This is about transforming our metropolitan areas. And this is really important because over half of humanity now lives in urban areas. This is also about transforming the suburbs, and Amy will go into depth about that. This is about transforming our agriculture. This is about regenerative agriculture. How do we have a practice of food production that gives back and doesn't just take? And ultimately, this is about greening the planet. How does the humanimal, as I like to call us, just to remind us that we are in fact animals, how do we have a broader, better relationship with all of creation as we know it here? So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. We'll be hearing from Braden Trauth tonight, as well as Amy Stross. Braden Trauth has a master's in design. He's the program coordinator for the horticulture program at the University of Cincinnati's Design architecture, art, and planning, which also includes horticulture. He's been teaching and consulting about permaculture since 2007 for my college math. That is about 13 years. He's worked with the Haitian Ministry of Agriculture on behalf of USAID and the Earthship Academy and across the US. He's the co-founder of the Cincinnati Permaculture Institute and its edible landscaping nursery Growing Value for the past 12 years and 10 years respectively. Braden has been involved with many public forage gardens around Cincinnati. Our second speaker who you'll be hearing from tonight, Amy. Amy specializes in permaculture gardening and edible landscaping and enjoys teaching and speaking about these topics. She holds a master's degree in education and has received certification from both permaculture design and community garden development. She runs the 10th Acre Farm website since 2013. And her first book, titled The Suburban Microfarm, Modern Solutions for Busy People, was first published and released in December of 2016. A full color edition was released in 2018 and was picked up and distributed by Chelsea Green Publishing. The book has won 3 awards. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Braden, who's going to talk a little bit more about the theory, education, and networks and resources of permaculture that are available in our region.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan, for that introduction, both of me and Amy, and also to permaculture. So let me go to full screen here. So let me just okay. So the Cincinnati Permaculture Institute, as Alan mentioned, was started in about 2010. We've been training people since about 2008. And in 2015 to 17, I worked on my master's thesis and really looked at how we could apply permaculture to actually product design. And out of that, I really recognized that really for us to achieve true sustainability, we need to be able to develop a society founded in permaculture. And that's really where this, the coalition, the Symbiotic Cincinnati Coalition really spawned from, was looking at how can we actually facilitate a transition towards a resilient, regenerative, and mutualistic culture. A mutualistic culture is really a theory founded in mutualism, which is organisms that benefit not just one other organism, but multiple, really all organisms. So I believe that humans, and many permaculturalists point this out, that humans really are the keystone species on Earth, and we have a capacity to either destroy ecosystems or create them. And we oftentimes don't hear about us creating ecosystems, but obviously there are a lot of cultures around the world for millennia who have done that. And permaculture really strives to reflect that and embody that. And so this is an attempt to move us beyond our fossil fuel industrialism, as we've seen in the last 200 or so years, and really the dysfunctional relationship that I would say the dominant culture has had with the planet for the last 10,000 years, to actually how do we transition with our new full awareness of ecological science. So that's where a lot of this is all founded in. And it's really looking at how to build intergenerational resilience and mutualism for the Cincinnati bioregion. So let me just, so what is it? So our coalition aims to build a sustainable future that is accessible and attainable for all members of society. So, and this future works with nature to enhance our local resilience, moving beyond the unsustainable economic booms and busts of economies founded in exponential consumption. So how do we actually, and if ultimately it is a coalition of organizations and businesses oriented towards fulfilling the basic directives that permaculture lays out. So just a second, I am going to shift one thing. Thank you for your patience. There we go, so I can see the screen better. So with this on the right, you'll see this image here. That is basically if we have a proactive response or a reactive response, or and combine it with a slow change or a rapid change. And this is actually pulled from the Transition Town Handbook, which was put together by, written by I forgot his first name, Hopkins, but in 2008. And basically it's looking at how, whether we're proactive in our response, and you can, in the top right, if we're proactive when we see a slow change, we could have a green tech future, sustainable development. If it's a slow change and a reactive response, which I would say we're sort of in the mix of the two right now, you could see ecological and societal decline, climate chaos, and business as usual. And the top left, I would say, was much more of what we saw in 2008, which was the power down economy that really started to spring up in 2009, 2010, with food relocalizing, people regreening their homes, and also people transitioning their modes of transportation as well. And then the bottom left is the collapse scenario with a rapid change and a proactive response. And that's if we do nothing and a rapid change happens. You could see a collapse of society. And I will say that that has happened at times, whether it's the Roman Empire or what else? There's several places around the world that I would say are currently in collapse as well. Haiti, having worked there extensively, I would say is close to it. However, the United Nations has provided political stability, and the US has provided food stability, which has prevented it from going into complete collapse. So, so the impact of fossil fuel and the cultural impact from consumption, currently people don't recognize just how powerful fossil fuel is and what it does to transform our world. This is a foundation that I offer to all of my students to help them understand just the impact and why it's so difficult to move beyond fossil fuel. But currently there's, well, in every gallon of gasoline, there's about 500 man hours of labor that are available in that gallon of gasoline, which is equivalent to about 12 weeks of human labor. And if you were paid $20 an hour, each barrel of oil, which currently sells for $42 a barrel, can create the equivalent of $975,000 worth of wealth in terms of transitioning the energy in a barrel of oil. That's how much embodied energy. And if you compare it to how much a human can put out in terms of energy, and paid them $20 an hour, which is a reasonable living wage, that translates to $975,000. And we currently pay about $42 a barrel, which is really just about the cost of getting it out of the ground and to the market. And currently with that fossil fuel, that's just oil. We also burn coal and natural gas. We burn 37,000 years of solar gain each day. And that's plants that lived and died millions of years ago, got sequestered under the ground, and turned into coal, oil, and natural gas. And so the amount of fossil fuel that we burn every day, it took the Earth 37,000 years to create that energy source in the form of plants living and dying. And so this is the foundational issue that we confront, is that we have built an advanced society founded in fossil fuel, but fossil fuel is a finite resource. It's also causing climate change. And so the transition is critical at this point for us to figure out how to move beyond this. The current industrial ag, our current industrial food system takes about 10 calories of fossil fuel to produce 1 calorie of food. So it's actually at a net loss in terms of production. And as I mentioned, climate impact, currently we've only absorbed carbon dioxide since 1970, or up to 1970. So we still have another 50 years of carbon dioxide. Even if we stopped putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere right now, we would still have 50 more years to absorb it. And we're already seeing these impacts of all the fossil fuel that was burned pre-1970, and also deforestation and agriculture is one of the other aspects that scientists have identified that is a major source of carbon. But all that carbon is from pre-1970. Everything since is still working on being absorbed, and it'll take another 50 years for what we're putting out today to be absorbed. So there's a lot more climate change on the way. And the other challenge we have is these are all the the oil fields in the US and Canada, most of them are accessed through hydraulic fracturing. So we have many more years of fossil fuel to access if we don't transition beyond it, if we don't take the initiative to move beyond fossil fuel. And with climate change, there is a good study recently put out by ProPublica just showing the potential impacts of climate change on every county in the US. This is just showing the heat impacts. This slide here of having how many weeks over 95 degrees per year. And Phoenix, you can see there, will have over 6 months a year over 95 degrees. And this is all by 1970, or I'm sorry, 2070. So another 50 years from now. But it also goes through sea level rise, ideal habitats for where humans can live, which is going to move north significantly, and also potential for fires, crop yields increasing and dropping. Colder climates will see their crop yields increase. And so we have a lot more impacts. And so these directives that we put forth with the Cincinnati Permaculture Institute Symbiotic Cincinnati Coalition is looking at how we can take today's wealth, our excess wealth, and invest it towards a resilient lifestyle that reduces our cost of living and also builds our resilience as well. So looking at how we can transition towards this world of a slower consumptive world that's built on renewable and regenerative materials and processes. Really, for us to achieve this, it really starts with housing and buildings and moving towards debt-free. I find the amount of debt that we pay for our homes really hobbles us and can prevent us from transitioning towards this regenerative future. And also the fact that it keeps us on a gerbil wheel to keep basically paying down debts and producing goods that can undermine the stability of the earth. So, and then also looking at how our housing and buildings can move towards net positive energy and water. This is a foundational concept that really, I think, if you look at nature, a tree is a net positive productive resource. It doesn't consume more than it produces. You know, it starts off as an oak tree, starts off as an acorn, and will produce thousands, probably millions of calories over its lifetime in many different forms, leaves, wood, other things like that. When it comes to food production, which is what we're mostly focusing on here, we're looking at passive production on low maintained and public and private lands. So how do we create foodscapes on those low maintained lands? And that could be edible landscapes, that can be fruit trees, nut trees, berry bushes, things like that on our private lands in our yards, but also where maybe institutions and businesses operate, but also where public lands, so that our public has access to fresh fruits, nuts that have a carbon negative footprint. And then also active production of food on high maintained public and private lands. And what I mean by that is more annual gardens and farming. And then the last piece is on our public lands, shifting our public lands towards 70% native edibles, which in the Midwest and the Eastern temperate climate zone, we actually have a lot of land to, we actually have a lot of native plants that are actually edible, that are a heritage from the Native Americans. For water management, we look at increasing hydrology using permaculture strategies founded in keyline design. And then when it comes to businesses, we're looking at transitioning businesses towards worker-owned businesses or B corporations that also work with regenerative certified farms or permaganic authenticated farms, which is a form of regenerative farming. And then social justice and transportation. So it has all these points, and they're very critical towards building a resilient future. So these directives, obviously, they build local food, energy, water, housing, and business resilience that can handle economic downturns and catastrophes in the worst of times, and increase our quality of living and capacity to live in the best of times. How do they increase our capacity to live sustainably? It reduces our carbon footprint on the production and deliver of energy, water, and food while increasing accessibility through lowering long-term cost. It reduces the pressure to produce unsustainable goods simply to earn a living since basic needs are taken care of. It also reduces the burden on the public and private sector to provide those resources. So for 12 years now, we've been training people in permaculture, and these students have gone on to have some major impacts throughout the community. These are some pictures of our classes. This on the left is one of the oldest public forage gardens in the city and one of the older ones in the country, planted in 2008 down on the Mill Creek Greenway Trail near Northside in Cincinnati. And then in the top right are students building a swale and working on a food guild. And then the bottom right is actually a former student who built a completely off-grid home known as an earth ship out of tires, cans, and bottles. It's heated by the sun, cooled by the earth, and powered by the sun, and harvests rainwater and recycles it 4 times. So impressive stuff. It's possible. We are doing it. Another way that we're doing it is by supporting students in the public in planting forage gardens and edible landscapes throughout the city through our nursery, which carries 165 different perennial edibles. We have 2 locations, one at the Eco Village in Price Hill on the west side of Cincinnati, and one down in northern Kentucky as well. This is a picture of some of the plants that we carry. And they're all plants to build food forests, self-regenerating food systems. Some are more cultivated, some are less cultivated. And this is an example of one which Alan is involved with and heads up, called Giving Trees, where, I don't know if you want to talk about this, Alan.
Sure, thank you, Braden. What I found from working with Braden and some of the other permaculturalists is that what we've created here is really this ecosystem for different projects and programs and even policies, if you take it up to that level, to really thrive and flourish. And so Giving Trees is, we raise money and we give the dollars out to people to buy fruit and nut trees and install them. Giving Trees is now in its 3rd year and it's raised about $42,000, primarily supporting schools, civic centers, faith communities, but also businesses and also private landowners. And so this goes back to my earlier comment of how come we can't walk down the street and there be food growing. So CPI, the Cincinnati Permaculture Institute, serves as the fiduciary for this program. And I will just say more broadly that some of the work that Braden and Amy and Doug and Chris, who you'll hear from later, they have really formed this, this hub, this interconnected network where you can get educated, where you can get the resources, where you can get connected to other like-minded people. And so it's kind of this living, breathing, beautiful network of people and resources that are helping to make these transitions. For a city the size of Cincinnati, we have an incredibly strong group of individuals led largely by some of the people that you're hearing about today who are helping us to make these transitions. Thank you, Braden.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Yeah, it's really imperative that we start investing now, and it really does take a community, and empowering each other to make these changes is really critical, and community is a foundational element of building a permanent culture. So a vision of what we're working towards is looking at how can we actually transition our city. And cities have not always been this big, and they're typically not sources of production. Sometimes they are in history. It just depends on the different scenarios that are playing out with the economy and things like that. So this just explains how the urban core typically has minimal production. And then as you get out to the first generation suburbs, a tenth to a fifth or a tenth to a half of an acre, you have some production. As you get further out, it starts to transition towards becoming self-sufficient, actually being productive. As you transition from the 1 acre to 5 acre size, you can be pretty much self-sufficient, almost productive. And then as you get further out, you have larger, more productive farms. So this is really just looking at how we can achieve this and recognizing that not everywhere can be fully productive. So I thank you for your time. If you want to learn more, you can always visit CincinnatiPermacultureInstitute.org about this, our classes, or the nursery. And so now I'll hand it over to Amy.
Thanks, Braden.
Yeah.
Let me just pull up my screen here. All right, you guys can see my screen, right? All righty. Well, I'm really appreciative to be here today, joining Braden and Alan and folks over at Lloyd Library. This is really great. So, as you can see, my focus is on bringing permaculture solutions to the suburbs. Alan gave me a nice little bio here in the beginning, but I'll just kind of share a little bit more about me. In the last 12 years, I've been able to work on a number of agriculturally related projects in the Cincinnati area. I worked for a few years as a landscape gardener, got to do some interesting things like install edible landscapes, pollinator-friendly gardens, herb gardens, things like that. I helped to manage a local farm that served 100 families with organic produce. And I founded a community garden at Mount St. Joe University. And of course, a lot of my work, though, has been developing my own edible yard and writing about that on my website, 10thacrefarm.com. And, that kind of led me to writing my book, The Suburban Microfarm. But, what the glue that has really held all of these experiences for me together has been the ability to study permaculture right here in Cincinnati. So, early in my sort of journey with all of this, I was, able to study with Braden and the Cincinnati Permaculture Institute. And, that has really influenced, my journey with all of this. So I'm, happy to be a part of this. So what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to talk about why we might want to focus on the suburbs, not exclusively, but really hone in on what is special about the suburbs. And part of that is going to be talking about some of the ecological challenges of the suburbs, as well as some of the opportunities to apply permaculture to the suburbs. And then, I'm going to mention the productive capacity. How much food can the suburbs really produce? And, Braden touched on that briefly, but I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more in detail. And finally, I'm going to share a part of my own story to highlight what's possible when we use permaculture design-based solutions in our landscapes. So why focus on the suburbs? Well, as it turns out, for the first time in our history, more than half of all Americans now live in the suburbs. And so because of this, there are some unique problems and also some unique challenges associated with this shift to suburban living. According to the American Farmland Trust, 2,000 acres of agricultural land are converted to development every single day. I'm not sure about you, but for me, this is incredibly alarming. So we have this situation where, selling farmland to developers is more lucrative than keeping farmland for food production. And not only that, but when these farms are sold and divided up, we're also losing crucial habitat and ecological services. And, along those lines, a few years ago, NASA was looking at satellite images of the United States. And, really what they were looking at was they wanted to know what crop was the largest. So, by acreage. So, they thought, corn would take up the most acres, or wheat or soy possibly. And so they were studying these satellite images, and they were surprised to find out that actually we have more acres of lawn than we do our largest crop, which happens to be corn. Now, this is significant because, our largest monoculture used to produce food, so at least it had some value. But, now our largest monoculture, doesn't support healthy ecology, and it doesn't produce food. So, you know, um, this is pretty depressing, right? So what can we do? Well, I think that it's time to reestablish living habitat for both humans and wildlife right where we live. And, this is the fun part. This is the hopeful part. This is the part that we get to participate in. Bill Mollison, the father of permaculture, he said, the greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, even if on a small scale in our own gardens. So this all sounds great, but how much food can the suburbs really produce? Well, the Ohio State University, they asked a very similar question. Now, they were looking at the city of Cleveland, but they were wondering if the city of Cleveland could really be self-sufficient. Like, what would it take? And they discovered that, yes, indeed, Cleveland could produce 100% of its needs for fresh vegetables, fruits, chicken eggs, and honey. And they would do this by using vacant lots, commercial flat rooftops, and just 9% of residential yards. And so, what this tells us is that small spaces are incredibly productive. And so, if an urban area like the city of Cleveland, could provide for their own needs, then I believe that the suburbs have the potential to not only meet their needs, but actually produce a surplus. And this is where we get into producing a resilient local food system, because now we have a surplus that can be shared or sold. And, along those lines, the University of London, England, they asked a similar question. They were wondering about the productive capacity of suburban land. And so they looked around the country, comparing suburban land to conventional farmland. And what they discovered was the suburban land was consistently 3 times more productive. And so what this highlights is that we can shift from this idea of mechanized macro farming to micro farming, really in our backyards. And it's not going to be a waste of time. In fact, it could help us shift toward a resilient and ecologically beneficial future. So what is permaculture? And I just kind of want to briefly go over this. I know you heard a lot of great things from Alan and Braden. One of the things about permaculture is that it encompasses so many things. And so there are many ways to define it. Now, I like to use the definition that permaculture is a system for designing agricultural landscapes that work with nature. And so that doesn't tell the whole story. We know that permaculture as a design system can help us create sustainable human settlements, and that encompasses, a lot of different aspects of living. But again, for the purposes of this presentation, this is kind of a definition that I like because we're sort of focusing on food production. So it's useful to have a visual of what's possible with permaculture. So I'm going to talk about my own yard as an example. And so, this is my starting point, 1/10 of an acre in the suburbs of Cincinnati. And that's kind of how my website, 10thacrefarm.com, got its name. When I first looked at this property, though, I didn't think it had any value or usefulness with regard to growing food. I only saw barriers. I saw small space. I saw that the backyard looked like it was completely shaded by 3 mature trees. I saw the ground sloping in weird ways. And I saw poor soil, right? This house was built in the 1950s, and during that time, the soil was, the topsoil was scraped away, and so what I was left with, and you might relate with this as well, being in the Cincinnati area, what I was left with was, this poor, lifeless, compacted clay subsoil. Now, one of the things that permaculture does is it challenges us to transform problems into solutions. So rather than focusing on what my yard doesn't have, I decided to look for opportunities to see, what it could provide. And so this is a picture of my front yard before I did anything to it agriculturally. But when I looked at my property more closely, rather than seeing only shade, for example, I actually found pockets of dappled sun. I just had to look more closely. I had to observe more closely. And, rather than only seeing shade, I found that actually it was, these trees were providing an abundance of leaves that I could turn into rich soil through composting. And another thing that I discovered is that the 1,200 square foot roof was collecting 24,000 gallons of rainwater annually. But guess what? It was going directly to the sewer. So I set out to design a landscape that captured this water. And so the first thing that I did was I disconnected the downspouts. And, using some permaculture strategies, I redirected that rainwater into the landscape. So I was sending about 12,000 gallons to the front yard and 12,000 gallons to the backyard. So that is less water and time needed for supplemental irrigation, and it's less water being sent to the sewer. So, this water, water is life. So this water really charged up that compacted soil. And, the landscape started growing hundreds of pounds of food each year, including fruits, vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Now, the harvest, of course, is fantastic. And of course, the beauty that this provided compared to, sort of a conventional landscape was, really amazing too. But there were actually a few other surprising benefits as well. I witnessed an ecological oasis develop in the middle of this lawn desert. I mean, over the course of 7 years, we saw an increase of birds, insects, pollinators, toads, snakes, spiders, you name it. It really is true that if you build it, they will come. So that part was really cool. And the other thing that was really neat was that I met a ton of my neighbors in the process. And so having this garden in my front yard was sort of a conversation starter. I didn't actually know anybody in my neighborhood, but once I put this front yard landscape in, I started meeting a ton of my neighbors and realizing that a lot of them had backyard gardens and that we had a lot of things in common. And I had lived here for years and didn't have any idea. And so, really when we talk about permaculture, being a connector, it really is a connector in more ways than one. Now, a lot goes into designing a permaculture landscape, and of course, our time is limited today. So I wanted to share just a couple of easy things to try at home. One thing that I like is planting an edible hedge. So the edible hedge is one of my favorite first steps because perennials really form the backbone of a permaculture garden or landscape. This is the picture of the currant bushes that I had in my front yard lining the front porch. Some of the things that I like currant bushes for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is that they can be pruned to a tidy shape and still produce fruit. And so with a lot of our berry bushes and shrubs, you know, a lot of times if you prune them too hard, they're not going to produce fruit for you. But currants are great producers, gooseberries, bush cherries, rose, aronia. Those are some of my favorites that can really, you know, create a little nice, tidy, edible hedge if that's something you're looking for. Another thing that I really liked about these currants is that they attracted the hummingbirds. And so it was kind of fun to sit on the front porch and watch the hummingbirds come in. Another important aspect of ecological property design is valuing the edges. So when I looked at my yard, I realized that I had one edge of the property that was underutilized, and that was the parking strip. We don't often think of the parking strip as being super productive. And, you know, of course, it depends on, you know, how much space you actually have there and, you know, how busy the road is. But, you know, I decided to take advantage of this spot. And so I planted 3 dwarf cherry trees in this space. I chose these dwarf trees, dwarf fruit trees, because they stand up to dogs, they stand up to kids on bikes, and you know, they produce pretty flowers in the spring. And of course, I mean, you know, the fruit is wonderful. But I was also surprised by how much these trees increased the ecological value of my property by bringing in early season pollinators. It really was, you know, a magnet during that time of the season. And so just kind of along those lines of planting fruit trees, I just kind of wanted to throw this illustration from my book in here. This is kind of an example of how a fruit tree guild works. Basically, a fruit tree guild is when we use underplantings of herbs and flowers, sometimes bushes and trees, or bushes and shrubs if we have space for them, to support the health of the tree and create more biodiversity. Now, you can see here that I have some examples of some things you might plant under the tree. And, you know, these are definitely just examples. This is not a recipe. What we're finding out is that the real importance here is that we are blanketing the landscape in biodiversity. So, you know, it's not so much important to pick the right things. Just know that, you know, we have some goals here. Maybe we want to attract pollinators. Maybe we want to provide habitat for beneficial insects so they can help, you know, keep our trees pest free. But another thing that we're learning is that whenever we create biodiversity above ground, we are also creating biodiversity below ground. And the soil ecology really does a lot of, has a big impact on the health of our trees. So again, I don't want you to think of this as a recipe, but I want you to think about this aspect of, you know, planting a variety of things to create a blanket of biodiversity. And so, you know, of course, one of the benefits of planting my cherry trees in particular was that they were so happy and productive. And we got about 30 pounds of cherries a year from these trees, from a space that I did not originally see as valuable. So when I started appreciating the space that I had, I was able to grow a significant amount of food for my household and increase my property's ecological value. I didn't have to choose one or the other. And that's kind of one of the benefits of using permaculture design to design our food producing landscapes. So the bottom line is that by using permaculture design, we can create residential spaces that send ripple effects into our community. And so, you know, in closing, the focus of my work is, you know, helping home-based gardeners connect more deeply with their land using a permaculture approach. If you're curious to learn more, I do have a free 10-day course that you can sign up for on my website. And there's also the link there for my book, The Suburban Microfarm. But yeah, I'm really happy to talk to you guys today. And Alan, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy, for running through that and talking about how we can adjust these practices. In the last remaining minutes, I would like to open up the question, and I'm going to start with you, Amy, but then I'm going to move to Braden. Help our audience understand your vision for the future. So they've learned about the theory, they've learned about the philosophy and the practices, and some of the real world things that that you guys are doing. Look 10, 20, 30, look 50 years into the future, right? To reference the ProPublica article that Braden pulled up to 2070. Where should we head? How do we get there? And Amy, we'll start with you, and then Braden will allow you to chime in as well.
Well, I think it's interesting to think about the future, because I think we are simultaneously heading in a hopeful direction and simultaneously heading in a not so hopeful direction. But I'm gonna sort of put my energy into the hopeful. And what I see, especially this year with COVID, what we've noticed is that it has been a bonkers year for people who have been stuck at home and getting interested in gardening. And, seed companies have been selling out, plant companies have been selling out. And for me, that is sort of a sign of the hopeful. And so I see this potential for ecologically rich neighborhoods, resilient neighborhoods where people are participating and being neighborly and swapping their surplus. I see that this can happen. And I think that permaculture is the glue, really, that helps us bring all of these components together and, brings them into right relationship with one another. So I think that's my short answer. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Amy. Braden, what would you like to add in terms of where you see us headed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have the foundations for really building that future across the board. And, I think pulling ourselves off of fossil fuel can be a challenge, but there are a lot of opportunities that are lower hanging fruit. And I think, the advancement of the regenerative organic certification, regenerative organic farming certification, which has some really great advocates behind it, including Patagonia. They actually just made the first regenerative organic cotton t-shirt that you can buy now. And one of the foundations of regenerative agriculture is that it's carbon sequestering. Another one that really gives me hope that I think building a future that works for everyone is the work done by drawdown.org with Paul Hawken. And one of his fellows is actually a well-known permaculturalist named Eric Tonesmeyer. And he's done some really excellent work to pioneer carbon farming and how we can passively sink carbon through regenerative and permaculture-based farming practices. I see that one as a huge opportunity, and that's where the regenerative organic certified had come from. But then also, on the local and regional scale, in our yards, as Amy just talked about, and the work that we've been doing, I really see us slowing down, which I think is a great thing, and enjoying life a little bit more, and really looking at, for me, the inspiration comes from looking at cultures that have been stable for long periods of time. And I think that really is the hope. Jeff Lawton, who is a well-known permaculturalist out of Australia, he was one of my teachers. He did a visit to a farm in Vietnam that was 2 acres. And it's been managed by this family. It's a food forest. It's been managed by this family for 27 generations. And that, to me, just underscores where we need to go, how we need to build a stable future for everyone, and how it's possible, and it has been done. And I think that as we look at those models and how do we adapt them culturally, and ecologically to our regions, and figure out strategies to really build the community. And, in the face of climate change, I think that there is the great hope that, Drawdown says that if we implement these practices, we can bring carbon levels to pre-industrial levels within 30 years if we implement these practices on a reasonable scale, really, and international scale, but at a reasonable scale. So, but yeah, so I see a lot of hopefulness, and some of these challenges that I used to think were insurmountable, I now see as completely surmountable. And, really, actually, Rudolf Steiner, one of the people who first developed the first form of organic agriculture before Sir Albert Howard developed organic agriculture as we know it. Rudolf Steiner developed biodynamic agriculture, but one of his things that he shared is he saw that humanity is going through adolescence right now. And we're learning how to grow up and take responsibility for our capacities. And I always think of how adolescents do irresponsible things. They think they're invincible, and maybe driving 100 miles an hour down the highway, which we can do these amazing things. And I think that sometimes irresponsible things, but I think that as we start to grow up as a human species, I think that we can start to realize that future.
Taking care of it. Tie a couple pieces together here. Steiner, in addition to biodynamics, started the Waldorf model of education. I can't help but think we know that COVID has been horrible in so many different areas of our lives, but it's been a forced slowdown, right? There's been a huge burst, as Amy mentioned, in a reinterest in home gardening. I am also encouraged. The fact that you two are here sharing what you know, and in terms of the networks and the resources with this audience. I will also say, Braden, remind me, how long have you been teaching at UC?
At UC for about 8 years now.
Okay, so you're bringing permaculture to the academy, right? You're bringing it into the university system, which, just to remind everybody here, it's the university system that came up with the extension service for our, what is now called traditional or conventional agriculture. And so what we're seeing, and I've seen this in my own work, is universities and institutions who are not land grants. And in our region, I'll just list them. This is Xavier, this is Miami and Oxford, this is Cincinnati State. They are actually the universities and the higher education institutions that are on the forefront of redesigning this. So they're working around this existing system. And that's not to say that the extension in Ohio State, they have sustainable aspects to their agricultural programs. They just tend to be dwarfed in terms of the money and resources that are put in. But we're seeing this percolating up of these thoughts and these ideas that are, dare I say, becoming mainstream. Which is awesome. So, and I'm just going to end by saying that for those of you that don't know, we have a regional food policy council, and they were just awarded $600,000 from the USDA to continue to do some of this really good work, right? To advocate for policy changes, to implement programs that make a difference. It's really exciting. And so I will end by saying that this is the paradigm shift. We are living in the middle of this paradigm shift. And people will look back in history and they will identify quite possibly that the coronavirus was one of these moments where we paused, we pivoted, and we headed in the right direction. And, maybe we went from adolescence to a late teenager during this time. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. That's great.
Yeah, thank you.
We're going to have questions and answers from the audience.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you very much again for joining us. And I really appreciate the fact that you guys have been putting some questions in the chat that is going to really kickstart this session right here. Please feel free to continue to put questions in the chat as they come up. I'm going to jump around here a little bit. I want to thank Greg and Abe for being the first two brave souls to go ahead and put their thoughts and questions out there. There are three specifically for Amy that I want to jump into right away. So Amy, the first one is, how have other people, and this comes from Bonnie, have other people in the neighborhood expressed interest in creating something similar on their properties, having seen your model?
Okay, I had to unmute myself. Sorry about that. All right, so the question is, have other people started similar things after seeing what I created in my yard?
Yeah, how they
yes, that's the question. Okay. Yeah, I think that I think what's really important is for people to have a visual of what's possible. Like you can, read about permaculture in books. You can get on the internet and, look at, blog posts, even on my own website. But, in the end, I think people really feel like they feel empowered when they see it in real life. And so, yes, I only did one official tour of my yard. As somebody mentioned earlier, I was a Civic Garden Center tour, and I think there were maybe like 20 or 30 people there, and it was just really wonderful. It sparked all kinds of questions, and I did get a lot of people sending me messages after that saying that yes, they went back to their own yards and were able to implement certain things that they so yes, I think it's totally worked. And I think also people on my street started growing more edible things in their front yard. Now, I don't know if that was because of me, but I didn't see it before I created my front yard garden. So I'm going to take partial credit for that.
Wonderful. Thank you. The next question also directed to you. This is coming from Linda. She says, what is the reason you took the downspouts off? She's talking about, can you direct the water from the downspouts into your yard? So she's listening from Texas. So if you could talk a little bit about that process. And I will say that ties into another question that comes later from Carla, who specifically says, could you say something about drought and how permaculture and what are some of the practices that deal with that? And she's thinking about water for her own garden here in Cincinnati.
Okay, good questions. So I have a funny story about the downspout. Yes, you can totally direct your downspout, directly into, whatever water strategies, water management strategies you're using in your landscape or garden. So a funny story about my front yard, we disconnected the downspout and I replaced it with a rain chain. And you guys might have seen, if you just Google rain chain, they're really, cute things and they look pretty and you see them a lot in rain gardens. And I just thought this was a nice ornamental thing to add to my front yard. And it was totally, it didn't have a functional use at all. But later I discovered, one of the things that we do in permaculture is that we take stock of the elements in the landscape that we might not have much control over. These are called sectors. So like, for example, privacy is something that you don't have a whole lot of control over. You can kind of, create privacy, but you can't control, where your neighbors are located or whatever. Well, one of these sectors, as we call them, is wind. And I had not taken proper stock of wind before I put that rain chain up. And so what I realized is the rain chain, because the water is now free flowing down from the roof, that wind was just blowing all of that water onto our front porch. And so that's sort of an example of, in permaculture design, we always want to take stock of our sectors and do some observations before we make decisions. So that's, my answer about the downspout. As far as drought, that kind of, dovetails into that, because, I feel like managing the water on your property is probably one of the first things that you want to look at, whether you're creating a garden or a landscape, or just, want to keep more water out of, the stormwater system. And so we can do that in a number of ways. There really isn't any one prescription, except I can say that what you want to start with is observing how water moves on your property. Where is it coming from, and where is it going? Where does it collect? Is there an area where it pools up? Are there areas that stay dry? And once you sort of have those types of answers collected, then you can kind of look for strategies to meet your goals and to work with the specific challenges that you're dealing with on your property. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, we'll stop there.
Thank you, Amy. We've got hold on, Braden. We got one more question about how do you prevent water from getting in your basement when you're doing this?
All right. So for me personally, I always try to make sure that any type of water management system is directing water away from the structure. And so let's say you're wanting to create a rain garden. You would make sure that that water is, directing away from the house. So that takes a little bit of observation to see, where the ground is sloping and where you might want to direct that water. And then the rain garden is going to be, I'd say, about, let's say 10 feet away from the house to be safe. And so, but there are, precautions that you want to make sure that you do. Gravity can always tell you like where the water wants to go. And, whether the strategies you're thinking about will solve your problems or not.
Amy, one more. Do you use a rain barrel?
Yes, I use rain barrels. I think it's important now. Remember in my presentation, I mentioned that my roof collected 24,000 gallons of water a year. And so when you think about a rain barrel collecting, 55 gallons, that's not a lot compared to what is coming off of the roof. So definitely when you're thinking about rain barrels, you want to make sure you're thinking about the overflow and where that water is going to go next once that barrel fills up.
Thank you. Braden, what would you like to add?
I was going to say, with the one woman being down in Austin, Texas, there's a great book called Harvesting Rainwater by Brad Lancaster. And he's out of Tucson. And that's actually where my mother-in-law is from. And I used to live in New Mexico as well. And so you guys are probably, well, Austin's a little bit more dry lands, maybe not quite as dry as Tucson or New Mexico, but being in the drylands climate ecosystem, that book has a lot of different strategies for harvesting rainwater and increasing productivity on your landscape. We're on the other end up here. We just had a record-breaking rainfall today of almost 2 inches in a day. However, we just went through a moderate drought, most of us as well. So one of the things I was going to say too is, there's a whole process in permaculture, and Amy's referencing it, but it's founded in a process called keyline design. And it's a real comprehensive design system for dispersing water around your property. And it's more geared towards large farms and things like that. But sorry, my dog's running around here. But it's more geared towards large properties. But going through these droughts for several years, we were a lot wetter. And I was thinking, well, in Cincinnati, maybe we don't need to do as much of the water management systems, the swales and things like that. But I will say this drought, which I think we've had 3 in the last decade that I can account for, just really underscores that we should have those systems in place, but you just need to design them to, when we do have large rainfall events, to shed the water when you don't need it. So.
Nice. Thank you. There's one question that came in from Sarah, and she's asking about planting in your parking strip from the municipality. And I'm actually going to take this one because I just had 4 peach trees in Northside that were very heavily cut. They got a heck of a haircut. And so I encourage you to do this, but you simply have to understand that that land is not yours. And while you may tend it and you may take care of it and you may water it and you may harvest it and eat it and process it, and all of that is fantastic, that's what we want. You simply have to know that when the tree people come, you should engage with them in a robust debate and conversation about what they want and how you can achieve it to meet your needs as well. If you are not home, they will do their job, which we promote urban forestry. We are fans of urban forestry. We want them to do that, right? There's really important things like, can you see the stop sign, for example? But just be mindful that when you put the tree there, it's not your tree, it's the city's tree. And if they need to tear up the sidewalk for something, they will, and they will go, your tree could be taken down, but that should not stop you. Plant those strips away. Amy, anything to add on that?
No, I think you covered it. Different municipalities have different guidelines for how you can use the parking strip. You might call up your local town council or whatever municipality you have and ask them, but typically it's not really a concern. You just, like Alan said, you have to know that it might not be taken care of the way you want it to. However, one thing that I can encourage you to do is, of course, make sure you know where the utility access is. So like, call before you dig, right? So when I planted my 3 dwarf cherry trees, I made sure that I avoided those utility access areas. And I also kept them pruned so that they weren't dropping fruit on the sidewalk or the street. That's another way that you can just be a good neighbor and not have people cursing our tree fruits that we want to have in our neighborhoods. And I also would say that planting perennials like trees is probably going to be better for avoiding dog pee and kids on bikes and things like that happen in parking strip areas.
Thank you, Amy. I want to shift now a little bit, and I want to talk about the youngsters. So as we all know, early childhood education is extremely important, and our ability to talk to the next generation about these things and engage them in these practices is one of the solutions to this. So Abe Underhill, who works at the Arlett Center at the University of Cincinnati, he asks, are there resources that distill the concepts of permaculture for young children? I have managed he calls it simple. Abe, you're not giving yourself enough credit here. Abe has done a fantastic job with the Arlett Playscape and also the Arlett immediate playground that is next to it, which you can see off of the Edwards building right across from the new Kroger. So he says he's managed this playground garden for many years, but he wants to invest in a more sustainable system. So I specifically am curious, Braden and Amy, are there children's permaculture books?
I feel like they're probably out there somewhere. I've seen a lot of people develop their own education materials, including actually Doug Crouch. He's developed some of his own. He'll be speaking here. They're not geared towards children. I do know locally we've had people talk about, even creating sort of a scout program, permaculture scout program for kids. But having 2 kids myself, I really think that is trying to raise them in a way that they appreciate it. And having lived out in New Mexico with a lot of friends who grew up in communes and some pretty radical places, I've also learned how to temper it too, so that they don't go the opposite direction too. So how do you make it engaging and participatory? And our older daughter, who's 13, I notice her starting, well, she's always been interested. She always helps me plant trees and things like that. But as she's turned into a teenager, her interests have shifted. And she is intrigued by it because now she's starting to understand, climate change and some of the bigger issues. So she is very intrigued by it. So
thank you. Amy, do you have anything to add on that?
One thing that I would add, there's a person named Jen Mendez, and she founded an organization named called Permakids, Permi, Permakids. And I don't know, I haven't followed up, so I don't know, what her how active her organization is. But I heard her on a number of podcasts a couple of years ago, and she had a lot of really great ideas and things to say about this topic. And I think she started a nonprofit around this topic. So I would just kind of Google Jen Mendez Permakids and see what comes up for you.
Thank you. We've got there's two of the 3 or 4 questions that I see left. There are 2 that are a little bit more deeper, I would say, not necessarily, but I want to address one before we get to those. Jenny Lohman asks, she's talking about her neighbor's yard, her neighbor's front yard as being the most productive area. And the neighbor says that he doesn't mind as long as I don't build a fence in terms of planting things. But she also says she's got deer pressure. What would your recommendations be? So she has a corner lot. Having a corner lot in neighbor's front yard would be the most productive sun area. She's good as long as she doesn't build a fence, but there's deer. So Jenny, I'm just going to say, is the neighbor okay with individual fences around the trees? And then I'm going to throw it out to Braden and Amy.
Yeah, deer is the biggest challenge in this region for us. They were extinct in Ohio by 1940, if you can imagine that. And they've come back full on. It's, it all depends on the site and setting it up site by site. And for one thing that I always recommend is observe where the deer are coming from and where they're going to. They're typically entering the property for something, whether it's just passing through, maybe to graze on some things that they've discovered, and then they come back. And I have a deer, we live in a pretty urban spot, and this one deer comes back and nibbles on my apples every year. I have found, caging can work. I've also found even putting wiring on the ground can work. It'll spook them, or lattice work on the ground because they don't want to break their legs. Wiring is a little less visible than lattice work. Of course, there are things like, Irish Spring soap and a lot of other strategies like that. But deer, they're seriously overpopulated in our region, and I know in many other regions too, but Cincinnati, it seems to be a big challenge. They come really far into the city. It's pretty impressive.
Amy, thoughts on deer?
Yeah, I think, Braden has some great ideas, because part of, doing something that, is going to be successful is, setting up your design properly. And, you have thinking about the deer before you actually get out there and plant is really a smart way to go. So, beyond figuring out where their main pathway is and kind of working with that, perhaps if it's along their main route, maybe you plant some, non-edible deer-resistant shrubs right along that path, so they can't browse right where they usually like to walk. And then maybe behind those deer-resistant shrubs, you can plant some things that you enjoy. But I would kind of focus on things that are deer-resistant. My brain is going to perennials because it's like a front yard area, and I don't know what you and your neighbor have in mind, but pawpaws, figs, and currants, gooseberries. Those are all some of my favorite edibles to plant with deer. And then pretty much all of your culinary and medicinal herbs are going to be deer resistant, and those make a nice understory.
Ice bush is another good one too, that
Mhm.
could be aesthetic and native and deer resistant.
Thank you both. Going back a little bit to what Abe was talking about in terms of children, Lola asks, how do you engage multi-generations in this process? And so Braden, if you could talk more about that. You said 27 generations managing that food forest.
Yeah, and permaculture, Bill Mollison set it up, to create a permanent culture. It's not just permanent agriculture, but it is this looking at it from an anthropological point of view. And, there's obviously some extreme cases or cases that I would say can keep our children from, running back to industrial society in some senses, like Amish, I think of, who live in our regions, but they create a sort of a culture that carries on in different ways. For me, it's how do you engage the industrial world, help people understand it and move beyond it, and just say, hey, this thing is not working. We need to be transitioning. And that's especially for the older generations, but for the younger generations, one of the things that I think of is how do you invest in a homestead or a family farm or something that can be handed down generation to generation. It may not happen this day and age. It's easy. I like to say a lot of us can become economic migrants for job purposes, but also for just desires to move to a place that we like more. And I will say staying close to family can also be challenging. And I know that isn't always an option for people, but I think developing that, I think it takes a lot of love, a lot of compassion, a lot of dialogue. We actually just recently moved to a home that is right up the street from where my great grandparents lived, but on both sides on my dad's family. And they actually had a little homestead. They were right off the boat, and they had a cow in their backyard. And so it is nice to have that opportunity. I know not everyone has that. And, it's tricky this day and age because fossil fuel allows us, we can live in in an apartment in a very urban spot and never engage the natural world and not have to worry about food, energy, or any of that. So it takes, I think, more open-heartedness, dialogue, and support to really make it work. So
thank you, Braden.
Yeah.
Greg Potter, our friend Greg Potter from the Civic Garden Center, he was one of the first ones to ask a question. And Amy, I think this is directed to you because it came during your presentation, but Braden, feel free to chime in. Can you elaborate on how suburban land can be 3 times more productive than farmland? ? And then he has another, he says, production method ?
Okay, so good question, Greg. All right, this is a study that I found from the University of London, England. I believe it came from the 1960s. Now, I was only able to find the abstract of this study and not the details. And so I don't know what the study said about why the suburbs could be 3 times more productive or why they found them to be that. But I'll tell you what my guess is. So my first guess is that when we are managing, so, let's say you have 1 acre of suburban land and it's your backyard, we would encourage you to observe and interact with your landscape. So you're going out every day and, walking through your garden, you're going to notice things. You're going to create a design that is based on, what's going on in the yard, your soil, your sun exposure, different things like the deer. You're going to design around those specific challenges. And every day you're going to go out there, you're going to walk your land, and you're going to notice when things need harvested. You're going to notice when things aren't growing well, when a pest comes on. and you're going to be able to react and respond to what you're seeing. And we also tend in those spaces to grow a polyculture rather than a monoculture. And all of those things work together to be more productive than, say, a monoculture of corn. And maybe you have a farmer who's growing hundreds of acres of corn. And so that 1 acre of corn is not going to be very productive because he's not interacting and engaging with it and responding to its needs. So that's my assumption, my assumption on what's going on there.
One book I could reference is Edible Forest Gardens, which is right behind me. Dave Jackie's Edible Forest Gardens, which is great for temperate climates, you know, in the eastern US, but also in the western US a bit as well. But he, in volume 1, he references a study that points out that just our temperate climate forests are 2 times more productive for kilocalories per square meter per year. Tropical rainforests, mangroves, and swamps and estuaries are 3 times as productive as agricultural land. And that's for all the biomass that's being produced. The other thing I would say is that farmland also is using a lot of fossil fuel, tractors, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers is a big one from natural gas. And, you know, when you're managing your yard, you're taking care of the soil, you're making it more productive, hopefully, especially if you're doing it organically or permaculturally. With permaculture too, as Amy's saying, you can stack layers of production just like a forest. And, you know, you're able to manage it. You're not using as much fossil fuel. We manage our yard without any fossil fuel. We have a 1/4 of an acre. And so it's, you know, carbon negative, which is great. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll just chime in. I just want to reiterate where permaculture is using the whole building. It's using the entire 10-story tree versus the farmland is 6 feet. So the photosynthetic energy that is being captured from, you know, 10 stories all the way down is ridiculously more than what we're doing in the fields. And we're not using as much fossil fuels or hardly any fossil fuels. We have about 3 minutes left, and there are 2 really good questions. One from Daniel Hart, and then another one about lawns. And Daniel's question, we addressed a little bit more when he talks about how do you change the mindsets of those that work in institutions? Meanwhile, the other question says, how do you change the mindsets of AKA my parents who really love their lawn and don't want it to be transformed? Because we do love our lawns. So the common theme here is, what is the connection? How do you change people's mindsets?
I mean, I'll just say real quick, lawn is a fossil fuel status symbol, really, at the end of the day. It's something that came about in industrialization. Amy points out, I think in her book, and I've heard her reference it in many talks, you know, it goes back to, well, the European royalty and the privilege not having to grow your food. And so a lawn was a status symbol that you didn't have to grow your food. You were so wealthy that you didn't have to do that. So taking it from that ethical perspective, I think is a good angle, you know, getting people to think about where this world comes from, that we've all inherited, we've wandered it, we've been born into, and, you know, that we're all participating in. And so, but I don't know if you have anything to add, Amy.
Yeah, so about changing people's minds, my first thought went back to my yard, which you saw in my presentation there. You know, when I first started, you know, putting that edible landscape in, I had a number of neighbors who really like their lawns and were outwardly unhappy with my decisions. But that's because they they saw me like digging holes in my yard. That's when I was creating a rain garden. You know, they saw me in the installation phase, the design and installation phase. And what I needed to do was hold out for the design to be complete and for the, you know, things to grow and the flowers to bloom. And I think we change minds by providing examples, visual examples of an alternative, because you know, these neighbors who were decidedly unhappy with my decisions at first, you know, later I had one guy behind me come up in the middle of the summer and say, you know, I'm really sorry that I, you know, kind of gave you the cold shoulder, because now I see what you were trying to do. And he asked for a tour, and so I gave him a tour. And then ultimately, this man who really liked his lawn, and that was his main hobby, was maintaining his lawn, offered me a portion of his lawn to create a garden that I maintained and shared with all of our neighbors. And so I think we change minds by just doing what we do and continuing to be good models of what we want to see. And it's hard to not be frustrated when people have different mindsets, but I think you know, that whole you know, be the change you wish to see in the world, I think that there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amy. I'd like to turn it over to Patricia now.
Thank you, Alan, Braden, and Amy. Fantastic. And thank you, audience, for being here, your great questions. And I do want to remind you, if you're not aware, that we have part 2 of this coming November 19th, so next month. You can register through the link that you got for tonight's program, or you can go to our website and find more information and register. So we hope to see you back next month and for other Lloyd programs. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.